Alright, so I'm back with another video because I felt like I wanted to add something to the video I put out yesterday, because I feel like there was a few things that I forgot and like some things that I wanted to talk about and didn't. So this is kind of like an addendum to the video I put out yesterday. So if you haven't seen that, you should probably go watch that first. So I wanted to add and expand on a few things. For example, balance is something I completely neglected to talk about, which a friend of mine reminded me about. Balance in ESO is really a huge problem because one thing they would do is that, every quarterly release they would add some kind of balance changes, and many times it would completely change which classes were good, which rotations were good, and that kind of thing is like pretty bad because as a player, you have an expectation that when you play a certain class, it has a certain play style, and if they keep changing the play style, suddenly it doesn't feel like you're in control of the class anymore. It feels like they're making the decisions for you, which is like balance is supposed to even the playing field, but what they do is that they nerf everything into the ground, and it's like, oh, sorcerers are good, and then 3 months from now they nerf the shit out of them, and then sorcerers suck. And it's like, oh, all the sorcerers players, what do they do now? I guess they either play a class that is fucking ass in PvE and PvP all of a sudden, or they like switch to a new character, and then that new character is like, let's nerf the shit out of that one, and then 3 months later that's the one that gets nerfed. And then maybe sorcerers players, if they're lucky, they get a fucking, buff somewhere down the road unintentionally, and then they get nerfed again 3 months later. It's like a really bad cycle of balancing because they don't try to even the playing field. They just keep removing the ground under whatever works until everyone is at the bottom. And somehow, the DPS, like maximum DPS you can achieve, keeps getting higher and higher, and they just can't control it because they've made an uncontrollable system, by design. The champion point system, the gear that they add, they keep making players stronger, and even then, they keep nerfing them. And what it results in is a bigger divide between the new players and the endgame players. Because the endgame players know how to adapt, but the new players have no fucking clue. So they just feel like they get weaker, whereas the endgame players they find a new way to get even stronger every time. And one thing that really bothers me is that the slogan for ESO is play however you want. But then they put out sustain nerfs with Morrowind that absolutely killed variety in playstyles. After Morrowind, everyone went to the same static playstyle because everything else did not work anymore. And like maybe it's making a comeback now, like I can't really say because I haven't played the game for 6 months. But I just know that like after Morrowind, like some classes, the setups that people have been using just stopped working, and like you couldn't have fun builds that were still kind of viable in endgame because it just didn't work. Everyone had to focus on sustain, and after Morrowind, like the endgame community and the new players, like everyone took a hit, but the endgame community, like they thrived afterwards because they learned how to adapt. But everyone else is like probably still fucked by it because sustain is like fucking impossible now. It's like they took away like the things that actually made the game fun to make it harder. But it's like, what is the point of this? Like you're usually catering to a casual audience, but then you make it harder because of endgame players. It's like a weird duality in how they're proceeding with like balancing the game. It just doesn't make any sense. One thing also neglected to mention is that they keep saying that they're just about to fix Cyrodiil. And if you don't know, Cyrodiil is like the laggiest fucking place in the game. Like you crash, you fucking, you lag out because there's 200 players on screen or something. And it's like, it would be understandable if this was like the way that it worked the entire time. But everyone who's played the game since launch knows that in the beginning, you could play with 200 or 300 players on screen and not crash and not lag out. because it actually used to work. And it may sound like fucking lunacy if you look at the game now, because Cyrodiil is just always broken. And they always say they're going to fix it, and they never do. Another thing about the balance I forgot to mention is that they don't separate PvE and PvP. They balance both at the same time. So if something is good in PvE, it gets nerfed and it affects PvP. If something's good in PvP, it gets nerfed and it affects PvE. And a lot of changes like that, they like just make the game like so hard to play, because if you play as an endgame player, or just a player who is pretty active, you have to like always read the patch notes to see if your build is suddenly completely destroyed, and it just kind of sucks. One thing that really bothers me, like personally, is that the game doesn't have a good skill curve. Like most MMOs, they ease players into what is eventually going to be endgame PvE. And they do this by setting up their story missions in a way that they're difficult enough that it gives like a rising curve. ESO does not have that. All the story quests, everything is like laughably easy. There's like no challenge whatsoever. I've been playing other MMOs. Like I've played probably 10 different MMOs, and most of them manage to do this in a different way. It's like they add boss fights in story missions that require like telegraphing, but a lot of it, and it's like you have to be consistently sticking to dodging these attacks, otherwise you lose the story mission and you can't proceed. But ESO doesn't do that, because maybe it's like a side effect of a lot of players coming from single player Elder Scrolls and not really wanting a huge challenge, which is a little bit ridiculous. But I can't tell you why, but for some reason the casual audience wants to be handed rewards, and they don't want to have a challenge when they're doing story missions, because it breaks immersion or something. Like I don't know. And I think the specific playstyle that the endgame community has in ESO is actually pretty hard to grasp, because it's very different from other MMOs. Like, for example, the way you tank is like, it's pretty brutal. Like, they've made it easier, but it's pretty brutal. Like, you have to manually like tank things. Like, you can do a sort of pseudo tanking where you draw like everyone's attention with a certain skill, but mostly you have to like single taunt. Like, it's like other games have AoE taunts and stuff that makes it easier to be a tank. And it's not like saying that tanking is particularly hard in ESO. Like, there's some battles where it can be pretty tough, but it's like it's hard to get into, I think. Like, once you're into it, you know what you're doing. It can be pretty boring, but yeah, getting into tanking, getting into DPSing and doing the numbers required, like, it's actually pretty hard, because the game doesn't teach you how, because the game isn't designed to be played that way. Like, for example, you have this thing that people call weaving, and that's not a feature. That's an unintentional side effect of how the combat works. But people found out you could do that within a month of the game's release, probably even in the fucking beta. And it's just funny to see that the fucking developers don't even understand how the game can be played, because everything was designed around a very tanky playstyle in the beginning, where everyone was supposed to be like kind of off healer while being DPS. But no one played the game like that. They all like went like light armor, stacked everything into one resource just so they could do as much damage and burn through mechanics as fast as possible. And it's kind of befuddling how the developers didn't even notice you could do this. It's like they didn't really playtest their game. Another thing that's kind of weird is that people place a lot of emphasis on race, like, of your character. And it really doesn't matter unless you're like actually min-maxing everything. But people pretend it matters because it's one of the few things they can control. And if they're not really, like, if they're not very good at doing rotations or DPSing or whatever, they'll pretend that swapping to a different race, or whichever race is in fucking is in popular demand, they'll swap to that and think it gives you like a better DPS, even though maybe the increase is only 1 or 2%. It's really sad when you like look at it, because there's a lot of players that don't know how to play how you're supposed to play for endgame, because it's not taught to you by the game, it's taught to you by other players. One thing I forgot is to give credit to the game for having like a really nice art style. Like, I know that I'm being like mostly negative, because that's usually what you do when you're making a video like this. But yeah, like the art style is pretty nice, I think. Like, I like their 3D models, like I like most of their animations. Like, some of them are a little bit stiff, and sometimes there's a lot of like animation bugs. But I think overall, like the design for ESO is pretty good. The problem lies with all the features, in my opinion. Something I think is also sorely lacking is any sort of competitive element to like PvP, because they only have leaderboards. Like, there's no ranked, there's no arena PvP. I feel like ESO would be a perfect game for that. I think you could really bring back a lot of PvP players who usually leave every time something's like broken or something's like not good anymore. You could bring a lot of them back with like features like that, where it's like competitive. You could make tournaments, you could actually draw a lot of people to it. And the thing is, like, ESO does not have a huge presence online. There's not like a lot of people that make ESO videos on YouTube, for example. Like, when I think back to World of Warcraft in its golden days, it's like it was huge on YouTube. Like, there were so many like channels making content from it. And it's like, for a game like ESO where they keep saying, oh, we have 10 million, 15 million unique accounts. It's like, where's all that presence online? I can tell from my own videos, it's like, wow, I really made a banger because this one has 100,000 views. It's like, and I've looked at other videos, it's like, okay, this one has 400,000 views. But then you look at like old WoW videos from back when barely anyone used YouTube, and they have like millions of views. It's like, there's not even a comparison to be made there, because ESO just like, it doesn't have a presence online. And I can't tell if it's because the player base is way smaller than they actually say it is. But if you look at Steam charts, for example, across NA and EU, the peak of players on Steam, I know not everyone plays on Steam, but the peak there is like 34,000 consecutive players or something. And I think Steam probably makes up like 20-30% of the overall player base. So, it's definitely a lot lower than like 2 million concurrent players, whatever numbers they put out. Like, I feel like some of those are not really true, at least from playing on the PC NA, because there's a lot of times where it just feels like you're in a fucking ghost town. You're like, where the fuck is everyone? You go to a big city, there's like 12 people around. It's like, what the fuck? Where's all the millions of players that were advertised as playing this game? Lastly, I wanted to talk about Imperial City. I could have talked about this under the PvP part. But anyway, Imperial City is a pretty good example of how they design things, because it was meant to be a PvE and PvP zone, because like, they thought like maybe they could bring the two sides together like that. And all the PvP players were excited about like how amazing this like close quarter PvP was going to be, and all the PvE players were, well, not really that excited about the PvP part, to be honest. And it's like, when it came out, like, both sides were super disappointed, because there was too much PvP for PvE players, and it was too little PvP for PvP players. So you ended up with content that should have been fucking amazing, which really only caters to people, like myself, for example, who enjoy doing both PvE and PvP. Because like most people, they want a pure experience. They don't want like a mixed thing. Like I kind of like the inspiration they took from, what's it called, from Dark Souls, where like you lose your things you pick up, your Telvar stones, but they kept like reducing the number you lose every time you die, so it didn't like if you go in there now, it doesn't feel as exciting because you can't lose everything if you get killed. Now it's just like a place people go to grind XP or something. It's basically just a failure of of a content drop of something that should have been fucking amazing, because it's the fucking Imperial City. Like, come on. I think that's everything I have. Hopefully some of these, like, talking about a few more subjects that I forgot to mention in the previous video. And that's it. Thanks for watching.